The sand stretched endlessly in every direction under the scorching Iraqi sun. Captain David Reynolds pressed his binoculars against his face and watched the dust clouds on the horizon grow larger. His heart sank. Those were not ordinary dust clouds. They were tank columns, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The Iraqi Republican Guard was moving their armor toward American positions, and they were moving fast. It was January 1991, just hours before Operation Desert Storm would officially begin. For months, Iraqi forces had occupied Kuwait after Saddam Hussein ordered the invasion in August 1990. Now, a massive coalition of 35 nations led by the United States was preparing to drive them out. But intelligence had underestimated how many tanks Iraq had hidden in the desert. The numbers were staggering. Iraq possessed over 5,000 tanks, making it one of the largest armored forces in the world. Reynolds lowered his binoculars and looked at his radio operator. The young soldier's face was pale with worry. They both knew what those tanks meant. Traditional fighter jets could attack them, sure, but jets flew too fast and too high. By the time a jet made a pass, identified a target, and came back around, the tanks would have moved. What they needed was something that could hover over the battlefield, take its time, and pick off tanks one by one. But no such weapon existed. 3,000 miles away in Virginia, a phone rang in the darkness. Sarah Mitchell jolted awake and grabbed it on the second ring. Her husband mumbled something and rolled over, still asleep. Sarah squinted at the clock. 2 in the morning. This could not be good. The voice on the other end belonged to Colonel Patterson from the Pentagon. His words were clipped and urgent. The situation in the Gulf had changed. They needed the project ready. Not in 3 months as planned. Not in 3 weeks. They needed it now. Within 24 hours, Sarah sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. For 6 months, her team at Langley Air Force Base had been working on an experimental weapons project. The idea seemed insane to most people who heard it. Take a C-130 Hercules cargo plane, the workhorse of the Air Force, and mount a massive cannon on its side. Turn a transport plane into a flying tank destroyer. The concept had been tested before in Vietnam with smaller guns, but nothing like what Sarah's team proposed. They wanted to mount a 105mm howitzer, the same gun used on M1 Abrams tanks, inside the plane. The problems were enormous. The recoil from such a powerful weapon could rip the plane apart. The weight would throw off the aircraft's balance. The targeting systems would need to work while the plane banked in a constant left turn. Every engineer Sarah consulted said it would take months of careful testing. But now the Pentagon was saying they had one night. Sarah threw on her clothes and drove through the empty streets to Langley Air Force Base. Her mind raced through calculations and problems. Could they really do this? One mistake, and they would send a crew to their deaths in a plane that might tear itself apart the first time it fired. The hangar lights blazed when she arrived. Her team was already gathering. Master Sergeant James Torres stood by the C-130, his weathered face showing every one of his 20 years maintaining aircraft. Next to him was Lieutenant Mike Davidson, a weapons specialist who had volunteered to be the first gunner if they could make this work. Major Frank Cooper, the test pilot, paced near the nose of the plane, studying the modifications they had already started. Sarah spread the blueprints across a metal table. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, she could see the doubt in their eyes. They all knew what was at stake. In the Gulf, soldiers like Captain Reynolds were staring down the barrels of thousands of enemy tanks. Traditional air support was spread thin. The A-10 Warthogs, designed for tank killing, were great, but there were not enough of them. Attack helicopters were vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. The coalition needed something new, something the Iraqis would not expect. The C-130 sitting in the hangar looked like any other cargo plane. It had carried troops and supplies for decades. Its 4 turboprop engines were reliable, but not fast. It cruised at less than 400 miles per hour, slow by military standards. But that slowness might be its greatest advantage. A slow-moving plane could orbit a battlefield, giving its crew time to aim carefully and destroy target after target. Torres walked over to the blueprints and tapped the drawing of the cannon mounting. He shook his head slowly. In his 2 decades of service, he had seen crazy ideas before, but this topped them all. The 105mm howitzer weighed over 3,000 pounds. Mounting it inside the plane would require cutting into the fuselage, reinforcing the floor, and creating a system to absorb the massive recoil. And it had to do all of this in less than 24 hours. Sarah looked at each member of her team. She saw the exhaustion, the doubt, but also something else: determination. They were engineers and mechanics, not combat soldiers, but they understood their work would save lives. Somewhere in the desert, men like Captain Reynolds were counting on people like them to give them a fighting chance. The clock on the hangar wall showed 2:30 in the morning. They had approximately 21 hours until the plane needed to be ready for testing. After that, it would be loaded onto a transport and flown to the Gulf. Sarah took a deep breath and picked up a wrench. There was no time for long speeches or detailed planning. They would figure it out as they went. Torres grabbed a cutting torch. Davidson began unpacking the massive cannon from its shipping crate. Cooper started calculating weight and balance numbers. The hangar filled with the sounds of grinding metal and shouted instructions. Outside, the Virginia night slowly gave way to dawn, but inside the hangar, time moved differently. Every minute felt like both an eternity and an instant. The cutting torch threw sparks across the hangar floor as Torres sliced through the C-130's metal skin. He had been cutting aircraft frames for 20 years, but his hands still trembled slightly. One wrong cut, and they would weaken the entire structure. The plane might hold together on the ground but fall apart in the air when stressed by combat maneuvers. Sarah stood beside him, directing the cut with a laser pointer. They were creating an opening in the left side of the fuselage large enough to allow the 105mm cannon to fire outward. The opening had to be precise. Too small, and the gun could not traverse properly. Too large, and they would compromise the plane's structural integrity. Every few minutes, Sarah checked her calculations again. The margin for error was almost zero. Across the hangar, Davidson and two mechanics struggled with a massive howitzer. The gun had been pulled from an M102 artillery piece, a weapon normally mounted on the ground with heavy supports to absorb its recoil. Now they needed to mount it inside a flying aircraft. The concept violated every principle of aircraft design. Planes were supposed to be light and balanced. This gun alone weighed over a ton, and they still needed to add ammunition, targeting equipment, and recoil absorption systems. The first major problem emerged around 4 in the morning. The mounting bolts they had were not strong enough. When the engineers tested the mount with hydraulic pressure simulating the gun's recoil, 2 bolts snapped like twigs. If that happened in flight, the loose cannon could smash through the plane's interior, killing everyone aboard or ripping through critical systems. Torres rubbed his tired eyes and looked at the broken bolts. They needed stronger ones, but military supply chains did not work at 4 in the morning. Then a young mechanic named Eddie Chun had an idea. The base maintenance depot had bolts designed for securing tank turrets to armored vehicles. Those bolts were engineered to handle massive shock loads. It was technically against regulations to use tank parts on aircraft, but these were not normal circumstances. Chin jumped into a Jeep and raced across the dark base to the depot. He woke up a very annoyed supply sergeant and explained the situation. 20 minutes later, he returned with a box of bolts that looked like they could hold a building together. They were oversized and heavy, adding more weight to an already overloaded aircraft, but they would not break. While Torres and his team installed the new bolts, Sarah worked on an even bigger problem. The targeting system was a nightmare. The C-130 had basic navigation equipment, but nothing designed to aim a cannon while the plane banked in a circle. They needed to combine a helicopter gunner's targeting sight with the plane's navigation computer and somehow make them talk to each other. The equipment came from different decades and different manufacturers. It was like trying to make a 1970s television work with a 1990s computer. Major Cooper joined her at the electronics bench. As the pilot, he needed to understand how the system would work. The plan called for him to fly the plane in a constant left bank, circling the target area. This would point the left side mounted gun toward the ground. The gunner would track targets through a sight and fire when ready. But the plane would be moving the whole time, so the targeting computer needed to account for speed, altitude, bank angle, and wind. Each variable affected where the shell would land. Sarah connected wires and circuit boards, testing each connection. Half the time, nothing happened. The other half, error messages flashed across screens. She felt the weight of the ticking clock. Somewhere in Iraq, Captain Reynolds was probably watching those tank columns get closer. Every minute they spent troubleshooting was a minute less for testing and deployment. Davidson came over with another problem. The ammunition feed system kept jamming. The 105mm shells were large and heavy. They needed a system to move shells from storage to the gun quickly and smoothly. But the feed mechanism they designed kept catching on the plane's ribs and interior structure. If it jammed during combat, the gunship would be helpless, circling over enemy forces with a useless weapon. The team gathered around the feed system. Torres suggested cutting away more of the interior structure to give the shells clearance. Sarah worried that would weaken the plane too much. Chun proposed padding the shells to prevent them from catching. Cooper pointed out that would slow down the feed rate. For 10 minutes, they debated while precious time slipped away. Finally, Sarah made a decision. They would slightly modify the feed mechanism's angle and add smooth guide rails along the interior. It would take 2 hours of careful work, but it seemed like the solution most likely to work without creating new problems. Torres nodded and grabbed his tools. There was no time to second-guess now. Dawn broke over Virginia. The team had been working for 7 hours straight. The hangar smelled of metal shavings, welding fumes, and too much coffee. Sarah's back ached from bending over blueprints. Torres's hands were covered in small cuts from wrestling with sharp metal edges. Davidson's eyes were red from staring at computer screens. Cooper had been running calculations until the numbers blurred together, but slowly, impossibly, the pieces were coming together. The cannon sat mounted in its new home, the massive bolts holding it firmly in place. The targeting system, after hours of troubleshooting, finally displayed a proper sight picture. The ammunition feed glided smoothly along its new rails, delivering shells without catching. Sarah stepped back and looked at their creation. It looked strange, almost wrong. The graceful lines of the cargo plane had been violated by the brutal presence of the howitzer jutting from its side. Cables and equipment packed the interior where cargo pallets normally sat. It was ugly and improvised, held together with borrowed parts and desperate innovation. Torres stood beside her, wiping grease from his hands. He had doubted this could work, but now, seeing it nearly complete, he felt something different. Pride, maybe your hope. This strange hybrid of transport plane and artillery piece might actually function. More importantly, it might save lives. The clock showed 11 in the morning. They had spent 9 hours building and testing. That left 12 hours for final assembly, ground testing, and preparation for the first flight. The hardest part still lay ahead. They had built it. Now, they had to prove it could fly without killing its crew. The afternoon sun beat down on the runway as the modified C-130 sat ready for its first test flight. Sarah stood on the tarmac, her stomach tight with anxiety. 12 hours ago, this had been a normal cargo plane. Now it was something entirely new, untested, and possibly dangerous. Everything they had built was based on theory and rushed calculations. In a few minutes, they would find out if those theories could survive reality. Major Cooper walked around the aircraft, performing his pre-flight inspection. He had flown C-130s for 15 years and knew every sound, every vibration that was normal. Today, nothing would be normal. The plane sat lower on its left side, weighed down by the cannon and ammunition. The center of gravity had shifted in ways that could make the aircraft unstable. But Cooper had volunteered for this. Someone had to be first, and he trusted Sarah's team. Mostly, Davidson climbed through the side door, followed by 2 other crew members. As the gunner, he would operate the 105mm cannon during the test. He had trained on various weapons systems, but nothing prepared anyone for firing artillery from a flying aircraft. The recoil alone could be catastrophic. Engineers calculated it would be like being inside a metal room while someone hit the walls with a sledgehammer, over and over. Sarah joined them inside the plane. Colonel Patterson had ordered her to stay on the ground, but she refused. If something went wrong, she needed to see it happen, needed to understand what failed so they could fix it. Torres wanted to come too, but Sarah insisted he stay behind. If the plane crashed, the project would need someone who understood the modifications to start over. Cooper started the 4 turboprop engines one by one. They roared to life with their familiar growl, and the plane vibrated with power. He checked every gauge, every indicator. Oil pressure looked good. Hydraulics were responding. The extra weight was obvious in how the plane felt, but nothing seemed immediately wrong. He released the brakes, and the C-130 began rolling toward the runway down on the ground. Torres and the rest of the team watched. Several of them held their breath. Chun clutched the blueprints like a security blanket. If this test failed, those blueprints might be all they had left to start over. Military engineers from the Pentagon had arrived an hour ago to observe. They stood apart from Sarah's team, their faces showing skepticism. Most of them thought this whole project was insane. Cooper aligned the plane with the runway and pushed the throttles forward. The engine screamed and the C-130 accelerated. 70 knots. 80. 90. The nose lifted. 100 knots. The main wheels left the ground, and the modified gunship climbed into the clear Virginia sky. Inside, Sarah felt the familiar sensation of flight, but everything else felt wrong. The plane tilted slightly to the left, wanting to roll toward the heavy cannon side. Cooper fought the controls, trimming to compensate. They climbed to 5,000 feet over a restricted military range in the Virginia wilderness. Below them, old tank hulks sat as targets, leftovers from decades of weapons testing. This is where they would find out if a cargo plane could really become a tank killer. Cooper banked the aircraft into a left turn, putting the cannon side toward the ground. The plane groaned under the stress. Sarah heard creaks and pops from the modified frame. Were those normal sounds or signs of structural failure? She could not tell. Davidson peered through his targeting sight. The crosshairs wobbled as Cooper fought to maintain a steady orbit. The gunner's hands were slick with sweat as he gripped the controls. Through his headset, he heard Cooper give clearance to fire when ready. Davidson took a breath, aligned the sight on the closest tank hulk, and pressed the trigger. The explosion of sound and violence exceeded every prediction. The 105mm cannon roared, and the entire aircraft bucked like a wild animal. Smoke filled the cabin. Alarm screamed. Sarah was thrown against the bulkhead, her shoulder slamming into metal. For 3 terrible seconds, she thought they were going down. The plane shuddered and dropped 50 feet before Cooper regained control. The smoke began to clear. Sarah pulled herself up, her shoulder throbbing. She looked around frantically. Davidson was still at his station, shaken but alive. The other crew members checked their equipment. And incredibly, all the indicators were green. The plane was still flying. The cannon mount had held. The bolts had not failed. They had survived the first shot. Cooper's voice came through the headset, steady despite what had just happened. He asked if everyone was okay and if the systems were functioning. Sarah checked the monitoring equipment. Some readings had spiked during the shot, but everything returned to normal ranges. The structural stress was enormous, but within tolerances. Barely, Davidson looked at Sarah. She could see the question in his eyes. Should they try again? She thought about Captain Reynolds in Iraq, about the thousands of coalition soldiers who would face those Iraqi tanks. One test shot proved nothing. They needed to know if the system could fire repeatedly without failing. Sarah nodded. The second shot was less shocking because they knew what to expect, but just as violent. The plane bucked and smoke filled the cabin again. But this time, Cooper maintained altitude better. The crew stayed braced. And again, the aircraft held together. Through gaps in the smoke, Davidson saw the targeting camera. Both shots had hit near their targets. The accuracy was rough, but workable. They fired 5 more times. Each shot taught them something new. The optimal bank angle for stability. How much altitude they lost per shot. The timing needed between shots to let the smoke clear. By the 7th shot, they were starting to work as a team, anticipating the violence and adapting to it. Cooper brought the plane back to Langley and landed smoothly. When the wheels touched down, The crew inside erupted in cheers. They had done it. They had turned an impossible idea into a functioning weapon system. As the plane taxied back to the hangar, Sarah looked out the window at Torres and the team. They were jumping and shouting, celebrating what they all knew was a miracle of engineering and courage. The Pentagon observers stood silent, their skepticism replaced by shock. They had just watched a cargo plane orbit a target area and destroy 7 targets in under 30 minutes. Colonel Patterson was already on his phone, probably calling his superiors. Sarah overheard fragments of his conversation. Words like revolutionary, game changer, and immediate deployment. The hangar erupted when they climbed out of the plane. But there was no time for celebration. They had proven the concept worked, but now came the hard part. The plane needed to be combat ready and transported to the Gulf. Sarah guessed they had maybe 8 hours before it would be loaded on a heavy transport. 8 hours to fix the damage from testing, load combat ammunition, and prepare it for war. The Iraqi desert stretched endlessly below as the modified C-130 circled its holding pattern. 3 days had passed since the test flight in Virginia. The plane had been stripped down, loaded onto a C-5 Galaxy transport, and flown across the Atlantic to Saudi Arabia. Now, it orbited 20 miles behind the front lines, waiting for its first real combat mission. Davidson sat at his gun station, his mouth dry despite drinking water constantly. Test targets did not shoot back. The Republican Guard would. Captain Reynolds crouched in his command post, a sandbag position that offered little protection against tank shells. The intelligence reports spread before him painted a grim picture. A major Iraqi armored thrust was developing 15 miles north. Satellite imagery showed at least 50 T-72 tanks forming up, along with armored personnel carriers and support vehicles. This was not a probe. This was a serious attack aimed at breaking through coalition lines. Reynolds had requested air support an hour ago. The reply came back negative. Every fighter and attack aircraft was committed to missions deeper in Iraq. The A-10 Warthogs, the dedicated tank killers, were grounded due to a sandstorm farther east. Attack helicopters had their hands full with Iraqi positions to the west. For the first time, Reynolds understood what soldiers must have felt facing German panzers in World War II with insufficient anti-tank weapons. Then his radio crackled with an unexpected message. An experimental aircraft was being diverted to his sector. Call sign Shadow 1. No other details. Reynolds had no idea what that meant, but at this point he would take any help he could get. His forward observers reported the Iraqi tanks were moving. They would reach firing range of American positions in 30 minutes. In the C-130, Major Cooper received the combat coordinates and banked toward the target area. The mission briefing had been minimal because nobody really knew how this would work in actual combat. The plan was simple in theory. Circle the battlefield at 5,000 feet, identify enemy armor, destroy it. But theory and reality rarely matched in war. The Iraqi tank column appeared on their sensors. Through the targeting optics, Davidson could see them clearly. The Soviet-made T-72 tanks were distinctive with their low profiles and reactive armor blocks. They moved in formation, following Iraqi doctrine that emphasized mass and shock. The Iraqis had learned from the Iran-Iraq War that concentrating armor could break through enemy lines. They were counting on their numbers to overwhelm American defenses. Davidson selected the lead tank as his first target. His hands steadied as training took over. All the fear and doubt faded, replaced by focus. Cooper put the plane into its combat orbit, the left bank that pointed the cannon groundward. The aircraft shuddered slightly in the turbulent desert air. Davidson compensated for the movement, for the wind, for the range. He pressed the trigger. The 105mm shell screamed down at over 1,500 feet per second. It struck the lead T-72 directly on its turret. The reactive armor, designed to defeat anti-tank missiles, meant nothing against the kinetic energy of an artillery shell fired from above. The tank exploded in a fireball that sent its turret spinning 20 feet into the air. Iraqi tankers called this the jack-in-the-box effect, where catastrophic ammunition detonation turned their vehicles into death traps. The Iraqi column halted in confusion. Tank commanders popped out of their hatches, scanning the sky for the threat. They saw the circling C-130 but could not process what they were seeing. It looked like a cargo plane, slow and vulnerable. Some Iraqi gunners tried to engage it with their tank cannons, but hitting a circling aircraft with a tank gun was nearly impossible. The rounds passed harmlessly below the C-130. Davidson fired again. Another T-72 erupted in flames. Then another. The Iraqi formation began to break apart as panic spread. Tank crews had trained to fight enemy tanks and infantry, not attacks from directly above. Their armor, thick on the front and sides, was thinnest on top. Every shot from the circling gunship struck where they were most vulnerable. Cooper maintained the orbit, his hands steady on the controls despite the buffeting and the recoil shocks from each shot. He had flown in combat before, in smaller actions, but nothing like this. Below him, $1 billion worth of Soviet military hardware was being systematically destroyed by a modified cargo plane that cost less than a single modern fighter jet. Reynolds and his men watched in amazement from their positions. They could see the gunship orbiting overhead like a bird of prey. Each time they heard the distant boom of its cannon, another Iraqi tank died. The enemy formation that had threatened to overrun their position was being torn apart. Some Iraqi tanks tried to retreat. Some tried to scatter. Nothing worked. The gunship followed them patiently, methodically, destroying tank after tank. Inside the C-130, Davidson was locked in a rhythm. Acquire target. Adjust for movement. Fire. Reload. Repeat. The smoke in the cabin was thick, the noise deafening even through hearing protection. Spent shell casings rolled across the floor. The targeting computer tracked their ammunition count. They had started with 40 rounds. Now, they were down to 20, then 10. Each shot had a count. After 30 minutes of continuous combat, Davidson fired his last round. The final tank in the Iraqi formation exploded just as the others had. Cooper turned the plane away from the battlefield and headed back toward base. Below them, over 20 Iraqi tanks burned. Others sat disabled or abandoned. The Iraqi attack had been shattered before it could develop into a serious threat. Reynolds grabbed his radio and called in a status report. The enemy armor assault had been repelled with minimal coalition casualties. When headquarters asked what had stopped the Iraqis, Reynolds struggled to find the right words. Finally, he just said that the experimental gunship had performed beyond all expectations. Some Air Force engineer deserved a medal, whoever they were. The C-130 landed back at its forward base as the sun set over the Saudi desert. The ground crew stared at the plane in disbelief. The left side was scorched black from muzzle blast. The interior reeked of gunpowder and smoke. But the aircraft had held together through its first real combat test. It had proven itself as a weapon system that could change how wars were fought. Davidson climbed out of the plane on shaky legs. His ears rang from the cannon fire. His shoulders ached from the recoil shocks. But he was smiling. They had taken an impossible idea, built it in 24 hours, and used it to save American lives. Sarah and Torres would be proud when they heard the news. Cooper filed his mission report that night. The experimental gunship had destroyed or disabled over 20 enemy tanks in a single mission. It had loitered over the battlefield for extended periods, something no fast-moving jet could do. The accuracy had been acceptable, and the aircraft had proven surprisingly survivable. His recommendation was simple. Build more of them. Build as many as possible. The age of the flying tank killer had begun. 1 week after the first combat mission, Sarah sat in a Pentagon briefing room watching video footage she still could not quite believe. The grainy black and white images showed their experimental gunship circling a battlefield, destroying tank after tank with mechanical precision. Generals and colonels filled the room, watching the same footage with expressions ranging from amazement to disbelief. The C-130 gunship had flown 6 more combat missions after that first engagement. Each mission proved the concept further. The aircraft had destroyed over 40 Iraqi tanks, dozens of armored vehicles, and countless trucks and artillery pieces. It had done this without losing a single crew member or suffering critical damage. The cost-effectiveness was staggering. Each mission cost less than a single cruise missile, but achieved far more results. General Morrison, the Air Force Chief of Staff, turned off the video and faced the room. His decision was immediate. They would begin converting more C-130s to this configuration right away. But they needed to move fast. The ground war portion of Desert Storm was beginning, and the coalition would need every tank killer they could field. He turned to Sarah and asked how quickly her team could modify additional aircraft. Sarah's mind raced through the calculations. Now that they had the blueprints and experience, they could work faster. The first plane had taken 24 desperate hours. The next ones could be done in a week each if they had enough personnel and resources. She told the general they could have 4 more aircraft ready within a month if the Air Force provided full support. The general nodded and told her she would have whatever she needed. Back at Langley, Torres received the news with mixed feelings. Pride in what they had accomplished, certainly, but also exhaustion at the thought of doing it all again 4 more times. Then he thought about Captain Reynolds and the countless soldiers whose lives would be saved by having these gunships overhead. The exhaustion did not matter. They had work to do. The team expanded rapidly. Engineers and mechanics from across the Air Force were assigned to Langley to help with the conversions. What had started as Sarah's small group of specialists became a full production program. The hangar that had held 1 experimental aircraft now housed 4 C-130s in various stages of modification. The sound of cutting torches and hammering filled the space day and night. Chun found himself training other mechanics on the techniques they had developed during that frantic first night. What had been desperate improvisation was now becoming standardized procedure. The bolt replacement that had seemed like a crazy idea was now written into the official modification manual. Every lesson they had learned through trial and error was being documented and shared. In Iraq, Cooper and Davidson flew their 8th combat mission. The Iraqi army was in full retreat now, abandoning equipment and positions as coalition forces advanced. But pockets of resistance remained, and the gunship was called in repeatedly to deal with Iraqi units that tried to make stands. The plane had become famous among coalition forces. Ground troops requested Shadow 1 by name when they needed air support. Reynolds, who had witnessed that first combat engagement, found himself explaining what he had seen to other officers who could not believe the reports. A cargo plane destroying tanks. It sounded absurd until you saw the footage or witnessed it yourself. He had written a commendation letter for the engineering team who built the aircraft, though he did not know their names. The letter worked its way up the chain of command until it reached Sarah's desk at Langley. She read it late one night while taking a break from overseeing the new conversions. Reynolds described watching the gunship save his position and his men. He wrote about the skill and courage of the crew, but he also wrote about the engineers who had made it possible. Whoever you are, wherever you are, you saved lives, he had written. You took an impossible idea and made it real. We will never forget that. Sarah felt tears in her eyes as she finished reading. This was why they had worked through the night, why Torres had doubted but pushed through anyway, why Davidson had volunteered to test an untried weapon system. Not for medals or recognition, but for moments like the one Reynolds described. Soldiers going home to their families because someone had figured out how to mount a cannon in a cargo plane. The war ended in February 1991, just 6 weeks after it began. The coalition victory was overwhelming, achieved with remarkably low casualties thanks in part to technological advantages like the experimental gunship. When Cooper and Davidson finally returned to the United States, they visited Langley to meet Sarah's team. It was the first time the builders and the operators had met face-to-face. The meeting was awkward at first, with both groups uncertain what to say. Then Torres walked up to Cooper and simply shook his hand. No words were necessary. The pilot and the mechanic understood each other perfectly. They had both taken enormous risks, trusting their lives and others' lives to calculations and craftsmanship performed under impossible pressure. The fact that everyone had survived and succeeded spoke for itself. The experimental gunship program was officially designated the AC-130U and entered full production. Over the following decades, these aircraft would serve in every major American military operation. They would become legendary among both the crews who flew them and the ground troops they protected. The basic concept that Sarah's team proved in 24 hours of desperate work would influence military aviation for generations. Sarah kept the blueprints from that first night framed on her office wall. The paper was stained with coffee and marked with crossed-out calculations and hasty notes. It looked nothing like an official military document. It looked like what it was, the frantic work of talented people trying to solve an impossible problem. Those crude sketches had become one of the most effective weapon systems ever created. Years later, Sarah gave a lecture at the Air Force Academy about the development of the AC-130. Young cadets sat fascinated as she described that 24-hour period, the problems they faced, and the solutions they improvised. At the end, one cadet asked what the most important lesson was from the whole experience. Sarah thought for a moment before answering. The lesson was not about engineering or weapons or even innovation, she said. The lesson was about what people could accomplish when they refused to accept that something was impossible. Every expert had told them the project would take months. They had done it in a day. Not because they were smarter than everyone else, but because soldiers needed them and failure was not acceptable. The modified C-130 that started it all eventually retired to the Air Force Museum. Visitors could walk around it, see the cannon mounted in its side, read the plaques describing its combat history. But the aircraft's real legacy was not in the museum. It was in the skies over conflict zones around the world, where AC-130 gunships continued to circle and protect, the descendants of that impossible idea built in a single desperate night.